are now listening to the Going Deep podcast with your hosts, Kevin Massari and Mike Bunt, live from the Cover One Sports Network. Here we go.
Welcome into another edition of the Going Deep podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Massari, here with Mike Bunt, and later on in the show, producer Kevin, to break down all things trade deadline, what the Bills have had happen this week, as well as there's another football game to be played on Sunday, a very important Sunday night football game against Mike's favorite Cincinnati Bengals. So we'll get to that and more, brought to you by Sons of Erie, www.sonsoferie.com. Check out all their great artwork and an awesome new set of apparel. Check out those hats at sonsoferie.com. First and foremost, feeling pretty good after a fairly active last 24 hours. Very interesting rumors. Bills were clearly at least semi-active, at least working the phones. Mike, what is your quick opinion on how the last 24 to 48 hours have gone for this Bills roster?
Turned out pretty well. You get a guy like Rasul Douglas, that's about as good as you could have hoped for going into trade deadline day. Obviously giving up a third-round pick, getting a fifth in return. I'm pretty excited. Cornerback was obviously a hole on this team ever since Trey White went down. And if you're going to replace him with a trade acquisition, you got one of the better available corners in the league and someone that at the very worst is a top 25 to 30 corner in this league, maybe even better according to his Pro Football Focus grades. And the way he fits the scheme, the way he fits this Bills defense, it should be a solid addition to this Bills secondary.
Yeah, it's an interesting move. I mean, it was by all accounts reported. I have inside people that I trust, and others had reported that the Bills were after corner. They were after it pretty strongly. Jalen Johnson was a top target of the Bills. I would seemingly think that a contract would have came with that, and they just didn't get there. The Bills did not feel comfortable enough without a second year involved in the contract. And we've seen this even with Nyheim Hines last year. We've seen this in even Kelvin Benjamin in the early days of Brandon Beane. We've seen this, him liking term on his trades. He does not like to give away assets, especially one that's decent for any type of one-year rental. So you saw it this season specifically where he wasn't feeling confident enough that he could get a deal done with Jalen Johnson and basically said, we're going to pivot, and pivoted to Rasul Douglas, a guy that came on late, third-round draft choice, was in and out of lineups early on in his career. Kind of reminds me a lot, Mike, of Leonard Floyd, a guy who had a lot of good draft tape, a guy that you expected something from early on, but just took a little bit to get going. Now Leonard Floyd's definitely one of the best pass rushers in the NFL, and Rasul Douglas is absolutely every bit as good of a corner. I've watched him film already, every good as bit of a cornerback, one that you want. Is he a top 10 guy? Probably not there, but he's definitely fairly close to that ranking of being an easily top 20, top 25 corner that you're looking for to add to any roster that already had a budding star in Christian Benford across from him. And then the eventual return of Trey White, probably next season, obviously, but the eventual return of him and his contract. And the funny part about him, Mike, Rasul Douglas, 1 year, $9 million option next year for the Bills. Fairly reasonable and a fairly easy option to work around if you'd like to keep him and or redo something with them. So Brandon Beane probably felt pretty great about a single digit in the millions, a cornerback one next season, that he felt comfortable enough swapping a third for a fifth. The trade value calculator says it's around a fourth. And, Brandon Beane has no issues dealing with fourth round value, as he seems to do every year, moving away from that to get Dalton Kincaid or Kaiir Elum. Doesn't seem to bother him. And guess what, Mike? We're going to have a fun draft day 3 special here on the Going Deep podcast, because last year we had 2 picks. This year we're going to have 7 picks. We're going to have a 4th, 2 5th, 3 6th, and a 7. So we're going to enjoy the draft day special, day 3 special this year, Mike. But just off face value, there's some data that I want to go over in a minute. But your reactions are Brandon Beane went out and got a cornerback one, I'm assuming?
Yeah, this is what fans wanted. Fans wanted a move, and I could tell throughout the day a lot of people were getting impatient, getting frustrated. Obviously, Jalen Johnson was at the center of the rumors. Would have been incredible if the Bills could have grabbed him, but obviously, this ain't that bad of a consolation prize if you're going to get someone else from the NFC North. And just a few random numbers. I'll let you go more into the metric side of things. But Rasul Douglas has 6 interceptions in the fourth quarter or overtime since 2021. That is the most among cornerbacks. Obviously, Greg Thompson, this was one of his targets going into trade deadline day. His 75.2 PFF grade ranks 21st of 129 cornerbacks with a minimum of 100 snaps overall. I'll let you go into some of the deeper numbers, but this is a guy that has played very consistent, solid football over the last 3 years with the Green Bay Packers. Before that, there was a little up and down when he was in Philadelphia and his single season in Carolina. But this is a guy that will instantly come to the Bills defense and really fit in to what they're trying to do. Will he start this Sunday? That's probably a tad bit fast for me. I mean, I expect him to be out there, but starting probably not this week, at least at this point. But you're talking about the rest of the year. Your secondary is now back to being one of your better strengths going forward. When you lost Trey, there was some worries. Obviously, there was concern about the safeties. Are they taking a step back? I think it's clear through the last few weeks that Micah Hyde, Jordan Poyer, they're carrying the team in the back end. Benford has been doing a solid job. Same with Taron Johnson. Now you add a guy like Rasul Douglas. I think it's safe to say your secondary is one of the strengths of this squad again. If they can get a guy like Daquan Jones back on the defensive line prior to the playoffs, assuming the Bills make it to the postseason, you essentially have your entire defense back minus Matt Milano, who they're still holding an outside hope that he could come back at some point late in the season. So after a day like today, you don't want to automatically jump and say things are great and perfect again, but you definitely start feeling a little bit more positive about what this defense can be going forward.
You have to. And you mentioned some PFF grades just to cap that one off. 10th in coverage in the NFL at the cornerback position, a tick better than this year than Tre'Davious White was before he went out, and right there with the likes of Sauce Gardner and better than Christian Gonzalez so far this season. So it was a very interesting trade where honestly, I had heard Rasul Douglas come up a few times, and I didn't think that Green Bay he had a very cheap minimum contract this year. Bills are only going to pay about $800K. Very doable contract and the Bills felt really good about Jalen Johnson's number this year too. And that's kind of what sparked the interest there. But I didn't think that the difference there was I didn't think Green Bay, especially for a 3-5 swap, I didn't think that they'd want to let go of that next year option. I know things went south on them this year, but man, really going from call it the 90th overall pick, just roughly to about the 140th overall pick. I mean, there's a little value there. But Bean was still able to calculate that and knowing that he has about the 97th or 98th overall pick there as well in the compensation pick for Tremaine Edmonds. So ultimately, great value there for the Bills. At first, I was told to me a 3rd and a 5. I thought that was okay, but expensive. But then once I found out it was a 3rd for 5 swap, that's when I was like, okay, yeah, that's a fairly good deal. Brandon Bean came out well. Just for next year's option alone, and then the bonus of having him as a kicker this year for half a season, those two combined, one or the other is decent value. But the fact that you have that option next year and then the ability to have him for this run were two really good combinations that I thought he could have been a trade target for the Bills at the end of the season. But to be able to get him at that price point on a minimum deal for 9 games is pretty good value. And to go into a few more statistics about Rasul Douglas that actually preaches to his availability, that he doesn't really miss games. Banged up Bill said he's only missed 2 in 2020, and that was for COVID-related things. Doesn't miss football games, which we know this regime puts a really strong importance on, especially knowing the injury rash that they've had over the last 12 to 14 months, starting with the Thanksgiving Day game in New Orleans with Trey White. And then ever really since then, they kind of had a little bit of rash of injuries. But some better stats for you: 26 in passer rating against in the NFL, 59.5, 15th in yards per coverage snap, only 0.5. It's a really good, meaning that he's really good at covering people and not having the ball thrown his way. 64th in completion percentage, meaning that really no big plays are being had in front of him. 31st in points saved. 29th in EPA per target, negative 0.18, meaning that every time you throw his way, it's a negative 0.18 from a cornerback. Very good. It's top 30, obviously. And 19 in busted coverage percentage, only 17.4% of the time. All those numbers combined, mixed with, if you like PFF, mixed with just some of the raw box score stuff with the interception stat you had. And all of a sudden, you have a pretty complete trade candidate that really, he's a pure example of someone that developed in his tenure. He isn't somebody that started fairly strong. He switched teams a lot from 2019, 2020. There was some movement in there that many had said there's a potential day two bust that we've heard about, like the AJ Epinesa mold maybe. But these guys just do develop, and they do figure it out after 3 and 4 seasons. It's not just Dalton Kincaid. It's not just Gregory Rousseau, where you got it right in the first 8 games. Sometimes it does take AJ Epinesa. Sometimes it does take 2.5, 3, 4 seasons, Mike. Teams give up a little bit too early, and something that Bills didn't feel quite comfortable with giving up Kaiir Elum yet when there was some rumblings, especially with the Josh Norman benching, and now the eventual replacement of him by Rasul Douglas, that you'd have to assume, and then Dane Jackson's obviously there too. Well, so really Dane got replaced, who had replaced Kaiir, which is music to my ears. But Mike, how do you feel about the Kaiir Elum situation, as this was pretty easy to assume they could have flipped him for a 4th or straight up for this deal? So what is your opinion on holding him now? Obviously, he's going to be a game day inactive. But what's your opinion on this Kaiir Elum situation where he's just going to be sitting without a jersey on game day now?
Yeah, I was fine with Brandon Beane going either way with Kaiir Elum. If he needed to part with him in order to acquire someone solid like a Rasul Douglas or Jalen Johnson, I was okay with that because you would be making the team better now in exchange for a person that really doesn't have an immediate future on your team. But I don't have any issues holding on to him. You can still believe in him and try to take whatever you can out of his development to try to maybe hope that you can salvage something next offseason. And if you can, maybe there is a possibility that Elum could still work his way onto the Bills, onto the field in the future. Obviously, the hope level isn't that high, but maybe Beane wasn't quite ready to give up completely on him. But this being said, it doesn't look good for Elum going forward now that you have 3 solid corners on this team once Trey White returns next year. Obviously, it's a big question. What type of player is Trey White going to be when he returns from this Achilles injury? But assuming that he makes a full recovery and he's out there, now you have a 1-2-3 that is Trey White, Rasul Douglas, Christian Benford. You don't really have room for Kaiir Elum as the 4th corner on this squad unless one of them makes a move to safety, which there is a possibility maybe after this injury that they go to Trey White and ask him, would you ever consider making a move to safety? I know a lot of fans last year talked about Benford being the guy that would have to rotate into the safety position to get reps. But I think Christian Benford has more than proved himself at cornerback. He's only 23 years old. He's on a rookie contract. He's been playing above average at that position. So I don't think the move would be to move Benford at this point in time. He is so solid at corner as your number 2 corner. It doesn't make sense for me to move him. And with a guy like Rasul Douglas, you might actually have an equivalent player to what Trey White was based on what Rasul Douglas has been doing so far this season. In fact, his grades are higher than what Trey White was doing earlier this year in a limited sample size. So maybe it is time to see if Trey would be willing to make that move in the future. Micah Hyde is not under contract after this season. Jordan Poyer has 1 year left. So there is a lot of questions about what you will do at the safety position going forward. And with Trey under contract for 2 more years, it might be time to start considering that possibility. But as for this team right now, I think it puts the corner room in a good spot where now Dane Jackson goes back to where he most likely should be, and that's be your primary backup corner. There's never really an issue with Dane Jackson coming up in the event of an injury. But to have to rely on him on a weekly basis, that's when you get into some trouble with his limited ceiling. So I think this kind of puts things back to where you want the rotation to be if you're a Bills fan or if you're one of the Bills coaches.
Yeah, and very solid overall addition, and especially at this price point. I was worried they might have to overpay in a situation that was talked about San Fran, who botched a acquisition of Adoree Jackson from the New York Giants, which was very interesting. In days of technology, people are still somehow botching trades. I don't understand how that's an issue. I don't really know, like, if the teams agreed to a deal, I don't really know where this is falling short for teams, but apparently that's still happening in the NFL in the year of 2023. But the Bills obviously had competitors There was much talks that the Bills may be interested in a one tech. Was there any discussions around Leonard Williams, a guy we saw go yesterday with a restructured contract? Did they make a call for Jonathan Allen? There's much discussions that they could have, at least as of yesterday, been working the one tech phones and realized early on that they didn't think that a deal was going to get done at that position. So let's put whatever resources we've allocated to this trade deadline to the corner room, which presented itself fairly early in a way where they went after Johnson right after the Sunday Night Football game, from all accounts that I've heard so far, that was one of their top targets. And I'm assuming Rasul Douglas working the phones with Green Bay in the back burner to make sure that value didn't present itself, which it ended up doing. So that's a pretty exciting time. And what's really great that you mentioned, Mike, the big physical nature of a player like him, just like Benford. He's one of the best coverage corners. Now, once he gets a few more hands on balls and or breaks up a few more things, he's going to be an elite level corner, because that sticky coverage is something you don't overly see often. And the way he made the play at the end of the game in Tampa, just play after play, and even made the play against Mike Evans that just happened to ricochet off his helmet, and just poor fashion, just unlucky fashion, the way that 18-play drive went to end the Tampa Bay game with a face mask penalty, with a ticky-tack. It's almost like the ref said target Taron Johnson after that Giants victory, because that was ticky-tack. That guy ran his route right into him. It was before 5 yards, but in the initial contact, that is not illegal contact by definition. That's a guy that ran his route deliberately, and Baker Mayfield never looked that way to extend a drive. I hated that call. The face mask was a face mask, a terrible play by Jordan Phillips. I don't know what he's thinking. You just stand there. It was stand there and the game's over, and botch that. But it took a couple of weird instances, a deflection off a helmet. But Christian Benford, in all accounts, was locked down against Mike Evans. And that's just a guy I'm not moving to safety at this point. He is your starting corner for the foreseeable future, unless something crazy happens. He's your cornerback. You know, he's battling cornerback. When he was guarding Mike Evans, one of the best receivers in the NFL, people forget, just because he's on like a bad Tampa team right now, or below average Tampa team, how good Mike Evans really is in his physical nature. He's a pretty good player. He's in the corner one status, and we'll see if he's able to elevate to a top 20 person. And I agree. I am not somebody that likes to convert, very rarely, like an Aaron Williams or others, do I like to convert a corner to safety. I don't see it. I don't see Trey White going there. He has the instincts. He has the read and react. I just don't know that he has the total frame and build and box nature, tackling ability of a Jordan Poyer or a box safety. I just don't really see it. Could he replace like a Micah Hyde that's a little more realistic? But I just don't think he has those total safety measurables that you're looking for. And I do think they run back Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer for at least one more season next year, with how well they're both playing. So I don't see the safety conversion. I don't see safety as the biggest need in the world either. But I wanted to quickly show the Raz. Look at the elite size grade. And this is what the Bills like. He's ringing in at 6'2" now, so probably even a little bit taller than he was at the combine many, many years ago now, when Raz basically first came out. But you see his height and his weight grade, his hands and arm. He has elite measurables that you're looking for there. Outside of like a 4.59 40, which is okay in a zone style game, he's okay in his 10-yard splits. He has average speed grade, but he's shown to put a little bit more speed on film to go with that elite size grade. And you're overly looking for round to 7 Raz at the cornerback position, as our guy Math Bomb has told us in the past. You're looking for a 7 Raz, and that usually works out well with the instincts, like it did here with Rasul Douglas. So, Mike, just the overall workflow of the corner room, what you saw against a really talented receiving core of Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, and others. I thought they played well against Cade Otton, who's a pretty good tight end. He's a developing young tight end himself. How did you think that they went? And now you're adding Rasul Douglas, which is, you can like Dane Jackson. I don't overly like him. I know you like him a little bit. But either way, you're replacing Dane Jackson with a Rasul Douglas. And all of a sudden, you feel a little bit better against matching up with some of the league's best, as you've already seen Christian Benford be able to do it.
Yeah, I felt good about the way they played against Tampa Bay. Obviously, an upgrade is always appreciated. As I said earlier, Dane, I feel most comfortable with him being the number 3 corner. I don't have issues with him filling in for a few weeks here or there if needed, because he can fill in and be a solid contributor when asked upon. He hasn't had a bad season this year by any standard, but this is definitely a true upgrade. And like I said earlier on the show, I think you're going to see the defense flowing a lot more effectively now going forward with a guy like Rasul Douglas in this lineup. You're getting a true low tier corner one, high tier corner two, and a guy like Rasul Douglas. So you match him up with Benford. This is going to bring solid results for the Bills defense. So any concerns after Trey White was out of the lineup, I feel like those are somewhat alleviated now with this acquisition.
Yeah, great. And one of Greg Thompson's favorite, if you guys watch on Friday, his free agent, or excuse me, his trade deadline recap special, he had Rasul Douglas in there with Sean Murphy-Bunting as some of his favorite targets. Jalen Johnson as well on the list. Rasul Douglas being the best value. Him and Murphy-Bunting had pretty good values. The difference was Rasul Douglas was not expiring. You have that 1 year, $9 million option, 2-year guaranteed due in March. So the Bills will make a decision fairly quickly. And that's just more of a placeholder year too. If they like his play over the next 9 weeks, he's going to get some type of medium-term extension. He's not crazy old 28 at the moment. They're going to give him some. They didn't just trade for him unless he tanks. They didn't just trade for him for that 1 year, $9 million option. They will move that money around and have him on the roster next year. In my predictive experience, he has zone experience, which is huge. He has those long arms that we've already showed you, and that height, weight, speed does check all the boxes there for him. So definitely comes in much coveted, a player that's developed, and that's what I really like to see. He's a guy that's grinded through a couple of different teams and proven that he's been able to get it done, and got that 3-year, $21 million extension from Green Bay, and he's played to that contract too. That was a good contract by Green Bay. At the time, it might have looked like a little bit much after only really being good for 1 year, but he's played to that over the last year and a half, being a Pro Bowl alternative in 2021, having a couple defensive players of the week. He can show out. There are games that he can affect, and that's every bit as much as what Philly wanted when they initially were thinking about him on their roster. So, Mike, great stuff at the corner room. The Bills also signed Leonard Fournette, which has been told to us as a potential elevation / he's going to the active roster once he gets up to speed as well. That news came down early. He's a receptions target, and they call him Playoff Lenny. Those are two things that, is it really pivotal that he's on the roster today over Ty Johnson? Probably not. You're probably not, seeing a huge upgrade there, but the Bills are interested. They've been interested in him since free agency. He's been a guy that's been in and out of discussions with the Bills, and he had him targeted. And in Playoff Lenny's coming back to town to help out a team, and he's got Super Bowl experience and really good playoff years. So I wanted to make sure we pointed that out. What is your opinion on bringing in, they don't have a fourth running back on their entire roster. So I'm assuming he's going to swap in with Ty Johnson, who also lost the returner job to Khalil Shakir and others, and Deontay Hardy, obviously. What's your opinion of bringing him in and probably swapping out Ty Johnson in the near future?
Yeah, it's not really an overly important move either way, in my opinion. I know some people are excited because Leonard Fournette obviously has a big name, former star at LSU, came into the league with huge aspirations of becoming a star running back, had a few 1,000-yard seasons. He's obviously way past that prime right now when he comes to Buffalo, but I think he could be a solid third-string running back for the Bills, someone that they can use in goal line situations and short yardage situations moving forward. Obviously, before the year, that was what Damian Harris was expected to do, and then he goes out. You need to replace that role. Latavius Murray, I thought he's had a solid year, but one area that he actually has struggled is cashing in these goal-to-go situations. He's been stuffed, I believe, 3 or 4 times, which is near the top of the league. And with a guy like Fournette, you're hoping maybe his size will be enough to just bruise his way into the end zone. He also is a decent pass catching back as well. It's something that a lot of people overlook when they talk about Fournette's game, is that he is heavily utilized in the passing game, or at least has been in the past with Tampa Bay. Now, will he be part of that in Buffalo? Who knows? But this is a guy that when Tampa Bay won the Super Bowl back in the 2020 season, lit it up in the playoffs. So you're hoping you can just get a little bit of that still with Leonard Fournette. Obviously, he's not going to take many carries away from James Cook, and I still think Latavius Murray is going to get the majority of the second string carries. But if anything, if he can help you out in the goal line, the short yardage situations, that'll be a plus for this team because it's severely lacking at the current moment. And we're hearing about it every week with the Bills running these shotgun runs near the goal line. I keep hearing people being frustrated with them, and I'm with everyone. It is frustrating seeing these shotgun runs, but there is some logic to it. When you have a quarterback like Josh Allen, who's athletic and able to run, when you're able to do these RPOs, the thought is that you can catch defenses off guard. But once in a while, you need Josh to run. Right now, they've become a little bit too predictable. But you're hoping with a guy like Fournette, maybe that won't matter. Maybe he can break the one tackle needed to find the paint. So, like I said, not a overly critical signing, but excited to see what he does, assuming that he stays in shape and eventually gets to the call-up in a few weeks, which I think you and I both expect.
Yeah, and you see right here an 8 Raz, really important. It's a really important out of a running back room. You need that explosive nature. You need that elite size. You need that elite speed. And outside of the vert jump, which he didn't do very well, many people forget he's a 4th overall pick, but basically 6'1", 240, really good arms and hand size, pretty fast for his size, and rings in above an 8 Raz. He worked on that vert jump, and all of a sudden you're into the 9-10 range from a running back position. So he does possess the height, weight, speed again that you're looking for. And the Bills have generally drafted fairly well with. So a lot of their Raz players have developed into good, solid football players that we've seen. Terrell Bernard, we've seen Christian Benford. We've seen others that use this with their instincts that the Bills look for. It's a pretty easy combination. Do you have good film? Do you have good instincts? Are you athletic? And that puzzle piece mixture can mean a lot. And the Bills are starting to prove that they're using some variation of that pie when they're selecting and or trading and or signing. So we'll see when he comes up. I think that, by all accounts, the Bills have been very excited to bring him in for a little while now. So I'm interested to see how quickly he's elevated to the roster and what the Bills do from here. They obviously have been working out tight ends as well. It's a position that they'd still like to use a little bit more in 12. I probably don't think they ideally want just Dalton Kincaid and Reggie Gilliam active on game day. I think they'd like a little bit more versatility than that. So we'll see if a tight end is brought in the near future as well. Adam Shaheen was in the workout area today. Trey McKitty, a guy that was waived, more of a tight end 3, but we'll see if the Bills want to tap into any of that potential there from the Chargers. But Mike, recapping the Bucs game, they dominated for the majority of the game. It was pretty much the opposite of the New England game. Played super well for 3 quarters, basically dominant football. And then kind of, they were still putting their foot on the gas as much more than people think. They were still throwing pretty often. And they just made some 50-50 decisions, by all accounts, that even favored punting a little bit, because the last thing you can do up 14 is put Baker Mayfield on the 50. It's not something like a team that was struggling beside one turnover to drive the ball inside the Bills territory. They couldn't move the ball. So giving them the ball at the 50 isn't ideal. And in this game flow, I don't mind the punting there. But ultimately, I don't think it was an issue. They needed some big luck to even be close to being in that game. And all around, a win's a win. That's a fairly talented football team that could still win that division when it's all said and done. We'll see if they're able to do so. As a recap of that game, with them going for 2. That's the new school thing, like go for 2 when you're down 2 touchdowns. Some teams are starting to do that as well, Mike. So as we pivot to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, just once again, that game, I think by all accounts, went about as well as you could expect outside of the final score. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, outside the final score, the Bills dominated the game.
Yeah.
I would have liked them to go for one of those 4th down opportunities in the third quarter. I understand why they didn't. You're up 2 scores. You trust the defense. Tampa didn't show anything that entire day that convinced McDermott or anyone else that they were going to be able to drive the distance of the field and put points up that way. I more so am a fan of going for the knockout punch. But as you said, there's this kind of narrative that the Bills let off the gas in the second half. That wasn't necessarily true. The Bills were still heavily passing it. Tampa Bay just adjusted and made some good plays in critical moments. And and put the Bills in some tough situations where you have to decide, well, am I going to punt or am I going to go for it? And obviously the Bills took a little bit more of a conservative approach in those fourth down decisions, but overall they were aggressive in their game plan and how they chose to attack Tampa for the entire contest. What I really liked about the game, and this has been talked about a lot already, but it was how the Bills came out. Obviously, we knew there was going to be a lot of 11 personnel because they didn't have the tight end depth going into the game to really run 12 personnel. So they were forced into running 11. But the fact that they ran up tempo, no huddle to start the game, and really put Tampa on their back feet and reacting to what the Bills were doing, I thought that was a tremendous adjustment by the Bills offense to kind of go back to their bread and butter. Obviously, a lot of fans were hoping for it and were vouching for that going into the game. And it was nice to see that the Bills can still have success going to their old strategies. What I thought was very comforting was that when the Bills were spreading it out, I think we saw that this team is more than just Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis. They do have other guys capable of making plays. Dalton Kincaid has now 2 weeks in a row really stepped up and had solid performances, including his first professional touchdown. And the strange thing is, if he didn't miss the one game, we're talking about a tight end as a rookie that'd be on pace for over 70 catches and 630 yards as a rookie. That's one of the best tight end rookie seasons of all time. And that's including this really slow offensive start by our perspective. You add on top of that, Khalil Shakir is really showing some development in recent weeks. He's surprisingly one of the best blocking wide receivers in football right now in his limited snaps. But also you saw some physicality and some elusiveness in the passing game where he was able to avoid a few tackles and make plays and go upfield with the ball. And Gabe Davis, major props to him on Thursday night. There's been a lot of criticism of him saying that he's not a good enough number 2 receiver, that he's not consistent enough. And I'll agree with the people about the consistency part. Now, the basis for it, I've always said it's a little bit more of how Dorsey schemes him and how Dorsey uses him than what it's actually Gabe Davis doing out there on the field. But what we saw on Thursday night was Davis used in a variety of ways that we have not seen him use throughout his entire Bills career. And the short passing game had some huge plays as a result of it. Gabe Davis had multiple short yardage receptions that he turned down the field and turned into extended yardage. So I thought that was very encouraging, seeing him actually get kind of more of a possession receiver role. And then Stephon Diggs is always doing his thing. James Cook, another solid performance. So the offense, I thought, took a step in the right direction. I do want to still see them be able to finish drives better for the most part. I do think they're stalling a little bit too often for my liking. But other than that, it was a step in the right direction. And I do hope once they do get Knox back involved, that they can use that 12 personnel in the second half to finish off teams. I do think that was something that might have helped them in the second half against Tampa when trying to put the game away. Once Tampa had adjusted to what the Bills were doing, it might have been nice to be able to use that 12 personnel every once in a while to keep Tampa on their toes.
Well, it's the time of the show to bring up producer Kevin. I want to get his thoughts on the Bills' acquisition of Rasul Douglas. So we'll bring that topic back up for just another quick couple minutes so we can get his opinion and his thoughts on that. And then it's time to go to the Cincinnati Bengals Sunday night football game, where I want to take it. So that's going to be pretty exciting to get into that. But as always, the show is brought to you by Sons of Erie, www.sonsoferie.com. Get out there, check out all their new merch and all of their artwork, some of my favorite stuff out there, sonsoferie.com. Also, we've been brought to you by Underdog Fantasy, one of the greatest fantasy apps out there. You can play best ball fantasy. Get out there, check it out. You don't need to set your lineups at times. You can bet some of the one of the most favorite games that I have out there is the ability to kind of pick different players and see how they'll do. That's super fun as well. Use promo code COVER1 as well for a match on all of your money up to $100. So promo code COVER1. So Mike, it's time to bring up producer Kevin onto the show. Producer Kevin, glad to have you as well onto the show. some quick opinions of Rasul Douglas would be great from your end. It's much talked about what he's going to be able to do from a cornerback one perspective, potentially even, shade him and hopefully take away one side of the field. I did want to, before we get Kevin's opinion, shout out some of the thoughts coming from Green Bay, who are actually pretty upset to lose this player. He's been told the third best rated player on the Packers this year. So this isn't just a guy that's kind of Dane Jackson of the Packers. This is a guy that had some pedigree that teams themselves, the Green Bay Packers and their fans, were pretty upset to lose. They picked him up. They basically developed him, and also said this is Micah Hyde all over again. That's one of the takes that I saw out of Green Bay, which is pretty shocking that they were able to develop Micah Hyde to lose him to be a stud safety in Buffalo. Some other comments that we saw that I saw from them. A lot of them didn't like their GM's move here. They thought that he deserved more or to keep him if this was all he's going to be. And can't believe we picked him up off the streets and made him an elite corner. That was said by another Green Bay Packers fan as well. So, Kevin, what's your opinion on Rasul Douglas, the Bills being fairly active? It's pretty evident now that they were working the phones for defensive players, notably corner, possibly even one tack. But what's your opinion on what they were able to do as they saw a couple of their other competitors, the 49ers, the Jags, a couple others make some moves? What is your opinion on what the Bills came away with?
Well, I really like this deal for the Bills getting Rasul Douglas. And I wasn't sure what they were going to do because there were so many different positions that they could go after, whether it's wide receiver or a tight end or defensive tackle, linebacker, cornerback. But I'm glad that they finalized this deal with the Green Bay Packers and getting a cornerback here on this roster, because if you think about it, the other positions, there's a chance that those guys can come back. Dawson Knox should be back within a few weeks. Let's not forget Justin Shorter is still on IR as a wide receiver. And then you go to the defensive side, Daquan Jones should be back at the end of the year, and there's still a slim chance that Matt Milano could return. So looking at it from that perspective, the Bills attack the position that they know they are not going to get any help with Trey White absolutely being done for the year. And the other reason why I like this deal so much is that Rasul Douglas is immediately the biggest corner on this Bills roster right now. So I put together a little depth chart here. Not even a depth chart, just the cornerback room. And just visibly, it looks so much better now as it's fortified here with this fourth outside corner. So it's Rasul Douglas, Christian Benford, Dane Jackson, Kaiir Elum, and then Taron Johnson and Saran Neal in the slot. And of course, should probably mention Josh Norman. But Rasul Douglas is 6'2", 210 pounds. Christian Benford is 6'1", 205. And then there's a drop-off. Dane Jackson's only 5'11", 180. So like I said, Rasul Douglas is immediately the biggest corner here in the room for the Bills. And they brought that size and physicality element. And another sneaky aspect of this deal that I like is that Douglas does not miss a lot of tackles. In his 7 years, only once has he had a missed tackle percentage above 9%. And if you look, Dane Jackson's missed tackle percentage is 15.2. Christian Benford has not missed a tackle this season. So there is your CB1 and CB2. Rasul Douglas and Christian Benford, two, maybe I shouldn't say studs, but, we're talking about Christian Benford becoming a stud. And I think Rasul Douglas, like you said, if he can have that Micah Hyde effect, I think Bills did a really good job here with this trade today.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is what they're going to be able to do. It isn't just a rental. I want to make sure we stress that enough on the show during different segments. I don't believe Rasul Douglas is anywhere near a rental. The Bills have a 1 year, $7 million deal plus a $2 million option on him. So 1 year, $9 million to keep Rasul Douglas in this defense. And I definitely think that was part of what was so intriguing about him, maybe over Sean Murphy-Bunting, and then probably over Jalen Johnson, a guy that was going to, yes, he's younger. He's been a stud. He's probably been an underratedly top 8 to 12 corner in the league, maybe a slight tick better than Rasul Douglas, maybe not. But it definitely had the youth on his end, and the Bills really wanted him longer than just 9 games. They did not feel comfortable enough that he'd sign a single-digit deal like Rasul Douglas has next year. And you're probably talking about two figures in front of the millions there for Jalen Johnson, probably in the 14 to 16 range. and they just don't have that flexibility right now with the unknown of Trey White. So the Bills did well. I don't believe he's a rental. He's going to figure out this defense, and that's a topic as we kind of transition Rasul Douglas into the Bengals game. The Bengals are now starting to tick on all cylinders finally. Team starts 3-3 like every year. I don't know what it is. It's really interesting what they do. There's always an injury. There's always this. There's always that. I don't think their coach is particularly good, but the quarterback does always figure it out. And they do always start to tick on all cylinders as they get into November, December, and then obviously into January. But Rasul Douglas, as you go into this game, he has his own experience. He knows what he's doing. And I don't think it's crazy that he's active. And I don't know that it's that crazy that he plays. So we'll have to see what Sean McDermott says tomorrow, as Tuesday does give you enough time to get in the building today, get in the rooms tomorrow, and play. It's not that crazy. I definitely expect them against Denver on Monday Night Football. But I don't think it's that wild to think that he plays in this game. And I think he moves the needle enough for me personally, because I'm the one of, I don't know where Kevin stands, but I'm one that does think that Dane Jackson is one of the bigger, weaker links on this roster. And if not the defense, just the defense alone, he's a big weak link, if not the entire roster. And thus the Bills kind of proved it. They went out there and replaced him. Like, they didn't replace Christian Benford. Obviously, Kaiir Elum was already replaced. So they went out there and replaced Dane Jackson because they probably agreed that he's an emergency corner, that he's a corner 4, that he's a guy that can come in and spot start, that knows the defense. But I do believe he's enough of a needle mover to put a guy back on the field. I don't think this move gets made with Trey White here. So I do believe that with this specific trade, he moves the needle enough for me to be confident against some of these teams that the Bills run a really good zone defense, right? So if you have a guy that's really good in zone, that can help McDermott out. And then you have a really good pass rush, that can help McDermott out a whole lot. And Kevin, we talked about Elum for a little while. So why don't you tell us what your thoughts were around the corner room, but then the Elum situation?
Well, I know we've had plenty of discussions about Kaiir Elum and his future here in Buffalo, and his name was getting ramped up a lot in trade talks, and there were a lot of rumors saying, will Brandon Beane move on? And, I'm glad he didn't, because I still like Kaiir Elum. I know. They just had a guy literally come off the street, 35-year-old Josh Norman, and he got a jersey ahead of Kaiir Elum. So it looks pretty bleak. But I went back and I found a video where Brandon Beane was talking about Wyatt Teller. And he's talked about this every single year ever since trading away Wyatt Teller. And in the video, he says, you learn to have patience as a general manager, and you don't want to give up on these players too soon. And it really bothers him. I mean, I've gone to a couple of events. It's called a seat at the table with Brandon Beane on the Sunday following the draft. And he'll even bring it up there. So whether it's, a closed-in event for the season ticket holders, or if it's to the public or to the media or whatever, Brandon Beane repeatedly talks about how he rushed his decision to trade away Wyatt Teller. I should say we did get Tyler Bass out of that, so I guess it did work in some ways. But regardless, Wyatt Teller turned out to be one of the best offensive linemen in the NFL. So as much as I was hearing this Kaiir Elum trade talk, I just really did not see Brandon Beane pulling the trigger already, not even 2 full years into it. So I'm glad that he stuck with Kaiir Elum here. And I'm glad that he went with Rasul Douglas, because if he were to acquire Jalen Johnson, you talk to him. I mean, that's a hefty price. You're going to have to give up a lot. You might have to give up on Elum. You're going to have to pay Jalen Johnson. So I just think that this is a perfect happy medium deal, getting Rasul Douglas to Orchard Park.
Absolutely. Mike, as we kind of look forward to the Bengals game now in Sunday Night Football, I know it's a topic that's near and dear to your heart as it's Bengals week. Here live on NBC. I think you've already touched on, you don't know if Douglas plays this week. I think against these big, rangy, speedy receivers, he would definitely be necessary. And if you're going to press him, it might be the week. And if there's anything that you don't think he's understanding, you go to Dane Jackson anyways. And at least you have him active in case one of them gets hurt. I think that's at the minimum. I still play him, though, because of his ability to learn zone defense. And it's not like a different style of defense than he's played in the past that he's got to learn up to speed as a second-round pick. This is a guy that's played successfully, and I personally would throw him out there and see what you're able to do against one of the best receiving corps in the league. I think that that's the timing of this. They're able to get him up to speed. So as you see these new weapons coming in for the Bengals, that the Bills are quite frequently pretty familiar with now since week 16, 17 of last year, the playoffs, and now, this is a fairly same looking offense. It's pretty similar. Their defense took a little bit of a hit, but they're still playing pretty good because I think they have a really good coordinator. But they did take a hit in the back there, in my opinion, and that's kind of where they started struggling, not just with Joe Burrow. So what's your kind of take on Rasul Douglas? Do you suit him up anyways? Like,
yeah,
it's corner.
No, he absolutely gets suited up this week. My thing isn't do you play him or not. He's obviously going to play on Sunday. My biggest question is, does he get the start? Do they throw him out there with the start right away? I absolutely want to see him on the field, especially when you're going up against one of the better passing attacks in the NFL when they have things clicking. So any help you can get to that secondary room, you take. It's not easy stopping the likes of Jamar Chase, Taj Boyd, T. Higgins, with Joe Burrow behind center, with Joe Mixon in the backfield. So whatever upgrades you can have to your defense, you're going to take advantage of.
I couldn't agree more. And this is a pretty big matchup as you look forward to this. I mean, you can put I guess equally so a little bit. Like the Bengals are surging. They're looking to get back on track fully. The Bills, have a couple of division losses of their own, some conference losses too. I mean, you're a situation to where the Bengals could be winless in the conference after this game. And that puts them pretty much really fighting for the wild card at that point. They're pretty much almost doom and gloom for the division, being 0-4 in the conference, 0-2 in the division. Like there is some comeback there, but they've lost to those teams already. So that there's kind of a big deal that this is pretty important for them to, in AFC seeding. They could lose out on tiebreakers to even make the playoffs if they're not careful. So I think that this game, and they have, once again, starting with San Fran, they have a pretty hard schedule themselves, playing their entire division again. And there's some big games mixed in there for the Bengals. So as you look at their schedule, Kevin, and you kind of break down what the Bengals need to do, are they in, nothing's must win territory for either team. It's really not. But you got a pretty pesky Texans team. You got a Ravens, Steelers, Jags, Steelers, Chiefs, Browns. Like they could win all those. They could lose every one of them. So what's your opinion on the Bengals side first? Do they have some extra motivation here? Or do you think the Bills come in with the more motivational side, having an extra couple of days of rest, trying to get back after what happened in the playoffs?
I think they're both equally motivated, because maybe I shouldn't say that this is a must-win game, but we're pretty close to must-win territory. Once it hits November, we're going to start seeing those games become must-win games. And I know some people might not want to say that just yet, but I'm going to say this is a must-win game for the Bills. Because if you drop to 5-4, it's your fourth conference loss. They have not the best divisional record right now. This is a huge game for the Bills, and I'm sure the Bengals are looking at it the same way. They got off to that rocky start. Now Burrow looks like he's healthier. So I'm thinking both teams want this just as bad as the other.
I don't think this is must win from making the postseason perspective. I think it's more so a must win if the Bills want to have a realistic chance at winning the AFC East with the way Miami is playing currently. Yes, Miami has some tougher games coming up, and the Bills obviously have the rematch the final week of the season. But the way the Dolphins are playing, they look like a team that's going to win anywhere between 11 to 13 games right now. So in order for the Bills to win the division, they're going to need to keep pace with the Dolphins on a weekly basis. And with Miami playing Kansas City, this could be an opportunity to retake the lead in the AFC East potentially this week. Now, for the postseason, we're talking about teams like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Houston, and those likes competing for the final wild card team. So I don't think must win as far as making the playoffs, because I do think there's going to be a bunch of teams in that 9-win territory, and I think 10 wins might be enough to get you into the postseason as the final wild card. But as far as momentum, as far as getting the second half of your season off to the right start, the Bills need to win to kind of show the rest of the league that they are back on track, and to build up some momentum heading into that difficult stretch of November when they're going to play teams like the Chiefs, play teams like the Cowboys, and so forth going forward. So this is the first of the difficult games on their schedule. And if they can find a way to get to 6-3 with the Broncos and the Jets at home afterwards, you can quietly get yourself to 8-3 and actually in a pretty solid position. The unfortunate part for the Bills right now is that they are not playing the Cincinnati Bengals that opened the season, in which Joe Burrow was a shell of himself. T. Higgins was not doing anything, and this defense was mediocre. We saw against San Fran the Cincinnati Bengals of the past 2 years. And if they come out on Sunday night with that confidence, that cockiness that they have as a team, it could be potentially a long night for the Bills, depending on which version of either team we see. But we have a lot to talk about regarding this matchup, because the last time the Bills took the field against Cincinnati, it was the worst loss we've seen the Bills take since the 2021 season. But there are some stats that show that the Bills are very good in rematches following a loss, and very good against teams that they lost to the prior year. I have two numbers. One of them I stole from Kevin, so credit to Masseri on this one. But since the 2020 playoffs, the Bills are 7-0 in rematch games against teams that they lost to either within the season or the previous year. Meaning if they lost to a team earlier in the year and they played them again that season, they won the rematch each time. And the same could be said if they lost a game to a team one year and then played them the next game in the following year. And to go one step further, this stat is a little bit different, but against teams the Bills have lost to in the prior season since 2020, the Bills are 12-3 the next year against those opponents. So basically what you see with those numbers is that Sean McDermott and the coaching staff, they might lose a game here or there, but they are normally really good at figuring out what you did to them and adjusting and finding out ways to get back at you. We've seen it with Kansas City a few times where the Bills lost in the playoffs to them back-to-back years, but found a way to win their next matchups in the regular season. So what are we going to see from the Bills on Sunday night? I think a lot of what they did this offseason was geared up towards basically going after a Cincinnati Bengals team. Now, the 12 personnel, I think, played a role in that, and obviously we're not going to see too much of that given the current situation. But defensively, how are the Bills going to be able to take on the Bengals? And once again, it's so unfortunate that Daquan Jones is going to be out once again against the Cincy team, because I think it would look a lot different against Joe Burrow if you had your big man inside just wreaking havoc.
It's definitely a really interesting game, as you kind of bring up. I mean, there's been some stats about how good Allen is on night games. And I think you brought up a good point about them being able to transition to the next time that they play. And a lot of times McDermott's able to take tendencies and see things that they were able to do the previous time. That's not a random stat. And in that 12-3 record that even you pulled, two of those were schedule changes, COVID year, when you didn't know what the schedule was going to. There was a time that they might have skipped that Tennessee game and played Kansas City. Like, that was a wacky, wild situation in two of those three losses in the 12-3 record. And not to mention the 7-0 since the 2020 playoffs, and then 6-0 in modern since the 2021 season in games in a rematch. So there's a lot of good stats in Josh Allen being undefeated on Sunday Night Football. So there's a lot of good things that the Bills do. And I do think that they built a roster to compete against their continuous contenders, Cincinnati's and the Kansas City's. They feel like they need to start winning in the divisional round and start winning in the hopefully in the championship round as well. These are situations where they need to build rosters to beat this team. And they felt fairly comfortable already beating the Miamis of the world, as they've proven. So they look forward and just quite frankly can get got sometimes by some of these rosters, like, a Bill Belichick coach team or a Robert Saleh defense. As Robert Saleh's defense analytically is good, it's not great, but they just seem to always be. They just look. That's an eye test team that looks way better than they play. and the offense is so mild, but needed some blunder by the Patriots, and they're still in it, or excuse me, by the Giants, and they're still in it based on these blunders, and they'll see Rodgers at some point in December, by all accounts, I believe. So we'll see what that develops. So there's sometimes the Bills can get got in those situations, but they build these rosters with Kansas City and Cincinnati in mind, because if you can't overcome them, you're going to continue to lose in the divisional round. But, there's going to be people that say, but Mike, you got to get there first. So I think that the Bills still feel fairly confident, and you certainly don't want to be in a 2-7-3-6 game against Cincinnati or KC in the first round. Like, that is something you want to avoid at all costs. I'm not 100% sure Kansas City will be the 1 or 2 seed. They're going to be able to waltz there even with a few losses. But I don't believe that Cincinnati will be in a top 3 seed. They could potentially scrape by in that division to get the 4 and win their division, or they'll be the top wildcard team in that 5 spot. So this could be the year that Cincinnati and KC match up in the divisional round. And that is something that Bills fans are rooting for in that situation. Put that on the other side of the bracket and hope the Bills are sitting in a 2 or 3 spot with a little bit different of a path than having to overcome Cincinnati and then Kansas City again in back-to-back games. And then off of a divisional game against Miami. That's death row. Essentially in a playoff bracket perspective, you can't get a lot harder than that. So it's definitely, they need to avoid those situations. And here's a game where they can avoid those situations, Kevin. I know it's not a must win. And there's talks that dropping to 0-4 in the conference, that starts to become a factor at some point. And that's about the time where now you're losing tiebreakers to Cleveland, Baltimore, Buffalo. You've even lost to Tennessee. That starts to become, although they play well at times, starts to become a factor, Kevin. So what's your opinion on, are you looking at playoff seeding at this point? Don't you have to?
Yeah, we probably should start. Like I said, I haven't yet, but I feel like once November hits, that's when it starts to ramp up a little bit. And then you start to look at the conference record, the division record, the different numbers and the ins and outs here and there. So I think we are definitely going to start having these conversations. And I think that this is that turning point in the season, because not only is it the flip of the calendar, but this is the start of the hard stretch for the Bills, where arguably that was the easy part, where you lose to the Jets, the Jags, the Patriots. And I was thinking that there was a chance the Bills could have been 7-1 at this point, but they're 5-3. So what does that mean? Well, you're going to have to make up for some of those losses with this harder part of your schedule. So maybe that means originally going into the season, I had Buffalo losing to Cincinnati, but you're going to have to find a way to win one of these games. You got to beat Cincinnati. You got to beat Kansas City, Philadelphia, Dallas. If you dropped 1 or 2 games that you shouldn't have earlier in the season, you're going to have to make up for it now in these next 2 months.
Absolutely true. And I know, Mike, you're a schedule predictor. You kind of look at games in chunks rather than like this one, that one, this one, that one. And the chunk at 5-3, I had him at 7-1 like Kevin did as well in that chunk. Very easy to see 6-2. That's not crazy to assume that's probably fair. 7-1's aggressive. It is. 6-2 is realistic, and 5-3 is probably, all things considered, a disappointing stretch, especially where people are probably looking. If people would have saw the Giants crazy win like by 30 and then a big Bucks win, they probably would feel a little bit better, even though that's a use. Like, that doesn't mean anything. But they still have one of the best score differential in the league, the best score differential since 2020. They do beat people big. Number 1 in the league in score differential since 2020. That narrative is super bizarre. Number 1 in score differential since 2020. They beat teams big. I don't know. You can't win by 30 every game. The Bucks game is proof of it. They were up 2 scores the entire game, and we've seen it here in Buffalo, where that game goes by 21 to 28 points very easily. Majority of the time, it just didn't happen with the 4th down decisions, the couple bad penalties. The next thing you know, you're up 17, 21, 24. And you're not like looking at a Hail Mary that dropped harmlessly to the ground. I don't care what anyone says. Godwin was not there to catch that ball. He was there to look at a deflected tip. The Bills that's just not a situation to where it was close. That was not even close. Didn't even get to Evans in that situation. Anyways, Mike, as you look at this schedule chunk that I wanted to bring up, we just went 5-3. You probably had us more in a modest 6-2, maybe even 5-3 if I know you. What are you looking at the next chunk of Bengals, Broncos, Jets, Eagles? That's a 4-game stretch coming up. There is some winnable home games in there with Broncos and Jets. Bills are 4-0 at home turf, not in neutral site. So 4-0 at home. So that's a pretty good looking stat. They do need to take that Broncos and Jets game to be in pretty good shape. But where do you stand with that pinched by the Bengals and the Eagles?
So I had them at 6-2 at the 8-game point. I thought that was the worst case scenario. And I do want to make a point. Like, while 5-3 isn't what we expected, it's not good overall for a team that many people thought could win 12, 13 games. The losses in hindsight aren't as bad as what many people are going to make them out to be. The Patriots loss is awful. Like, that's an inexcusable loss. Like, no doubt about it. This Jets team is now 4-3 with Zach Wilson. And they have a couple winnable games coming up. They play the Raiders, and they have another winnable game. There's a good chance this Jets team is going to be 5-4 when they head to Buffalo in a few weeks. So let's not act like the Jets are horrible. If they had Aaron Rodgers, there's a really good chance this Jets team could be 6-3 or better right now. The Jaguars loss, they started the year weak. They weren't playing well, but we've seen in recent weeks Jacksonville's playing good football right now. They have a better record than what the Bills have at the current moment. So to say Jacksonville was a weak loss, I think in hindsight, not exactly the case. Patriots loss, I'm all for it. I don't think the Jags, Jets, Patriots, any of those teams are above the Bills per se, but even good teams are going to lose against opponents that are on their level or beneath it. We just saw Kansas City score 9 points against a Denver Broncos team that allowed 70 against the Miami Dolphins. So it's the NFL. Weird things happen. Going into this next 3-game stretch, the Bills have to go no worse than 2-1. Now, if they lose to Cincinnati, you have to beat the Broncos. You have to beat the Jets. That gets you to 6-4, heading into a very difficult stretch. Now, ideally, you beat Cincy and you find a way to get 8-3. When you're playing Kansas City, Dallas, the Chargers, and the Eagles in a 4-game stretch, I think you're hoping to split those games. I realistically think you're hoping to go 2-2, and then if you split New England and Miami, maybe you go 3-3 down the stretch. You can still get to 10, 11 wins as long as you go 2-1 these next 3 games. If you beat Cincy, I think it is still on the table to win the AFC East. You lose to Cincy, I think you start looking wild card. But there's going to be a lot of overreactions based on this performance. I know, Kev, that you are iffy on ESPN's Football Power Index. It's a little bit too up and down for your taste, and I understand it. It
changes like weekly.
It changes based on every game, every performance, and it is kind of an iffy metric to use. But ESPN's FPI has the Bills actually favored in all of their remaining games except for Miami in Week 18. So while we normally would be scared of matchups against the Eagles, matchups at Kansas City, Dallas, and so forth, I don't think there's anything that those teams have shown to this point of the season that points to the Bills going into any of those games being scared that they can't win. I am honestly probably just as worried about this week as I would be any of those games. The Kansas City game, I feel like, is a coin flip that could go either way. Dallas, I would give the Bills a slight advantage. Philadelphia on the road, honestly, I might pick the Bills in that game. I know Philly is defending NFC champs and they're off to a 7-1 record, but just watching them on a game-by-game basis this year, they don't overly impress me. So if the Bills just found a way to win a couple of these close matchups, they would be in the same spot as a lot of these upcoming opponents. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm not as scared as the upcoming schedule as what a lot of Bills fans are. And I still think
you're not as high and low. You're not as high and low as others.
I'm still thinking 10, 11 wins based on, and then that was close to where I was before the year. Before the year, I was 11 to 12 wins. Right now, I'm 10 to 11 wins, and that's basically just because they lost one more game in the front 8 than what I had
To New England
before the year.
You have a New England loss in there now. Yeah, exactly. And don't forget this Dallas stretch is nothing. They just had a bye in there, but they lost to the Cardinals. They got crushed by the 49ers. They barely escaped the Chargers. So they had a stretch as well. And now they're coming to Buffalo in Dallas out of their dome. I don't look at that as overly, and it's a good team. I don't look at that as overly crazy with another game where the Bills should be favored. And as Kevin said, you need to start making sure you're plucking off some of these games. And maybe it's the at Eagles game where you can flip that New England game around.
Let me add something to it, Kev. We've been, you and I have been heavy DVOA advocates for multiple years on this show. And there's always been kind of that, denial by a lot of fans saying, well, if DVOA is that important of a metric, then why do the Bills fall short every year in the playoffs? Why do they not win it all? And I think this is a good year for the DVOA conversation, because right now they're still third in the metric despite their 5-3 record. And with all these challenging games coming forward, if the Bills start losing the majority of those contests, then we will see reflected change in the DVOA where they will drop. And then we will see that they aren't quite as good. So it will be kind of seen in their underlying metrics. So I think this is a good stretch to really see where does this team actually stand among their peers in the NFL.
Yeah, and to your DVOA point, and I'm going to get Kevin's opinion on this too, where we're going to do eye test versus nerd test. A segment I want to start implementing here. You got the Bills actually moved up to 3 total DVOA on offensive side of the ball. So they're looking pretty good. The defense is still faltering at times. They probably got dinged by that long drive at the end of the game by Baker Mayfield against a pretty average offense. But actually, the Tampa defense is better than the Bills defense. So you guys got to remember how well that the team played for 3 quarters, very well against a pretty good Tampa defense. That isn't an easy gimme, even if you want to call them the Dolphins defense or the Vegas defense has been pretty bad, or a couple others have been, Chicago's has been bad. Denver's, has been historically bad, but played pretty well against Kansas City, which is crazy showingly how much division games matter, even in a situation too, where Patrick Mahomes has never lost a division road game. And he just dominates the Denver Broncos as well. And you did see it in this situation where these division games at some point come back to get you. The Bills are not going to go 6-0 in the division every year. Hoping for 4-2 is where you need to be. And that's where they need to be this year and win those 3 division games. If they win those 3 division games in this portion of the schedule, I think they're in good shape for the division. And if they don't, I don't think they're in very good shape. So that's what's going to count for it. In the Tampa game, statistically, analytically, I pulled this. It's the least important game on the schedule because it doesn't help you in tiebreakers against your own division, which is common opponents. And guess, beside division record, the next thing, actually a lot of ties are broken by common opponents. And it's not a common opponent game with any of your division. And then it's an NFC game. So there's nothing there that helps you in an AFC wildcard or seedings battle. So in theory, the 17th game of the year, which are these 5th NFC games, these crossover games, aren't technically analytically as big as others. The Bills actually already lost a common opponents game in the Jaguars. That game was not in common with the rest of the division, meaning that if they're tied with the Dolphins, it's generally more likely that they will win the tiebreaker. The only caveat there now is that A, the Bills could sweep them, but B, that New England loss is going to really come back and bite them in a lot of ways because the Dolphins beat the Patriots twice. So we need the Jets to do something against them in the future weeks. But Kevin, asking you about eye test versus nerd test. Do you think, in your opinion right now, that their numbers and what you see on TV, I guess, or rewatching it or whatever you want to use, Bills are still 3rd DVOA in the league on offense? Does that feel right? 3rd overall. Baltimore's now having a pretty historic year, which is normal for them. They're regular season champions. And the Bills are now dropped to 14th defense. Does that all click for you?
I'm going to try to look at both sides here because I think that the Bills did something very important. I'm going to tie this back to what I was talking about last week on the show. And that's how I felt like the Bills' philosophy changed this year. with how they went into the season saying, hey, we're going to run 12 personnel. We have 2 tight ends now. We're going to establish a running game. We're going to win up front. We're going to be physical. And then they got decimated with injuries, and they tried with that same philosophy. And then we sat on this show, as many other people did. It was on Twitter. I mean, everyone was talking about how the Bills needed to unleash Josh Allen. And I think that the Bills kind of found themselves last week, aside from that fourth quarter. But the first 3 quarters, that was a beautiful offensive game plan. And it was like, finally, you're using Dalton Kincaid and Gabe Davis in more ways than just 40-yard vertical routes, and Khalil Shakir, and Josh was running. So I felt like the Bills got back to doing what they do best. And I said last week on the show that it's time to turn down the balance and turn up the aggressiveness. And I thought they did a great job of that. Again, minus that fourth quarter, because I would like to see them be a little bit more aggressive. But moving forward, I think we're going to see that aggressiveness, because I think the Bills saw that themselves. And even though I wish this wasn't true, Jordan Phillips even said it in the locker room a couple of weeks ago, they play to the level of their opponent. And now that they're getting into the thick part of their schedule, I think you're going to see this team come out with their fastball. Enough of the off-speed pitches. Go after them with your fastball. As a World Series going on right now.
Kevin wants them to use their number one pitch. And I think you see a true differentiator where, just like the Bengals feel like they're taking on all cylinders, the Bills now have pulled out a really good 11 personnel situation. So now they've pulled out a formation that they think is pretty good, even though they played still pretty well in 12. The Bills do have versatility in the 11 personnel situation, to where the one thing the Bills are lacking was that true slot receiver. Now you have Kincaid. Now you have Shakir showing to be the number 1 receiver last week overall in stats. That's not quite what teams were hoping to see. They were hoping that they would struggle a little bit more without Dawson Knox. So I think that there is plenty to like. And then to read the Cincinnati metric, Mike, they were playing awful before last week. Like not bad. They were playing awful. 21st DVOA going into the week, 18th on offense. On defense, they were 17th. I mean, it wasn't a good, even in the win they had against Seattle, they should have lost that game, where that took multiple botches by Geno Smith, a good Seattle team who went out and made a move today as well. Go ahead and botching their end of game situation as in that scenario. And then it took them looking pretty good against a team that probably shouldn't have played Brock Purdy. I mean, he was a concussion up until game time. That was a very interesting to see. He was put into protocol on Wednesday. He just didn't look like the Brock Purdy that, can run that Shanahan offense like we know how to run it. So, I mean, I think Lou Anarumo was like, you're going to play a guy coming right off of a concussion. Yeah, like that's probably not the time. We're not going to sit here and feast on him. And they did. Generally doesn't turn over the ball except for the fourth quarter last game and then against the Bengals. So, there's probably a concussion in play there. That's what, it's been said to me. But so we're going to see a 1-game sample size from Cincinnati, but it's a good game and it's a good team, Mike. As you kind of look at their metrics that we like to bring up, 23rd offensively last week, going before the San Francisco game. That's not 8th. That's not 15th. That's bottom tier level football. And I do think Burrow is quote unquote back. The team in general, Burrow aside, wasn't playing good until week 8. Do you think there's anything there? That's a little bit even later than normal for them.
Yeah, this is a tough one, Kev, because we are so metric driven, but I do think their metrics were severely hampered by what Joe was going through early in the year with his calf. The Bengals have been slow starters the previous 2 years, but they have always found their game mid-season and kind of ended season strong. I do think that injury played a major role in Cincinnati's struggles. Joe is a quarterback that's about his pinpoint accuracy, his timing. And even though he's not really a runner, he does have mobility in the pocket. That calf injury took away almost all of that. They had a game against the Browns in horrible weather to open the year. Burrow did not look good in the early season. And that's rightly reflected in the numbers right now. And you're right. San Fran was really the first game all year where they really had it going. And they're lucky that they found a way to beat the Rams and that they found a way to beat Seattle. Because if they didn't, right now they would be 2-5, and they would probably be a team that would be on the outside come playoff time. But they have found a way to get a little bit back on track. And this is going to be an important game for them and their playoff chances. If they lose to the Bills, Cincinnati could very well be on the outside looking in. I think the two most important things looking at this Bengals team right now is how do you shut down their big three, the receivers. Right now, their passing game has been very average. Look at the numbers for T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd. Neither of them have really done much. Like Boyd has 33 receptions, I believe, for like 243 yards. That's not a Tyler Boyd type season. T. Higgins has under 200 yards through 5+ games this year. He's not even on pace to have a 500, 600-yard season. Now, he probably will get closer now that they're starting to click. But people talk about Gabe Davis not being a good number 2 receiver. These guys in Cincy that people say are stars are not playing like stars right now, outside of Jamar Chase, who is just a generational talent. You also look at the Cincinnati running game. They have been horrific on the ground this year. As a team, they're averaging only 3.7 yards per carry and have 2 touchdowns. And so they're really not getting it done on the trenches, and especially defensively. If the Bills want a place to attack this team, it should be on the Cincinnati ground, stopping the run. Cincinnati is one of the worst teams in the NFL right now at stopping the run. They've allowed 5 yards per carry, 970 yards, and 6 touchdowns. So I think this is a game that you let James cook. And you sprinkle, obviously, some of the aspects of the 11 personnel in the pass game that we've seen last week against Tampa Bay. But there are things that the Bills can attack in this game before we go into our predictions.
There sure are. And one stat I wanted to bring up, just box score stat, and, sick of bringing up, I'm sure people are sick of EPAs, and they didn't even bring up any EPA today. We had to talk about the trade. I didn't want to really dive into 11 EPA too much. And, we'll let everyone stew over it. And we'll pull it up more next week when there's more data around it. Might have got a great Broncos guest next week. So we're going to bring some guests back next week as well. No trade deadline, obviously. And then and I think it'll be a good time with normal schedule 7. And then with a guest, I think we'll really enjoy that for next week. But Mike, they don't, beside a few Burrow runs, they don't have a single player on their team with over 7 carries beside Mixon. Like, they don't even have a complimentary game at all. And Mixon himself is still running at 4.0 yards per carry. I mean, key to this game is they're going to get theirs on offense if they're ticking on all cylinders. I think that's the way you tried to play the playoff game. You just weren't doing anything on offense. But ultimately, it's going to be a good test to see if they can take away Mixon and then maybe throw into their coverage-based team, hopefully with Rasul Douglas. All right, guys. It's time for score predictions brought to you by Sons of Erie, www.sonsoferie.com, and use promo code Going Deep for your ability to save extra on all things Sons of Erie. Mike, it's time. We might finally, beside week 1, have some differing predictions. I believe I feel it in my bones. We're going to start with Mike. It's a typical down to Kevin and then myself. So Mike, start us off with your predictions of this game.
So right now, I have not done well picking Bills games this year. I'm 5-3. I think I've picked them each week, and there's been justifiable reasons to pick them every week.
And that schedule.
For reasons left on the football field, the Bills have found a way to lose 3 games so far. This is the week I pick against the Bills. I'm going Cincinnati 30-24. I fully think the Bills are going to give them a much better game than what they did in the playoffs last year. My concern right now is I feel like the Cincinnati offense is finally starting to rediscover their identity, and it's against a Bills defense that is undermanned. I am scared not having Milano at linebacker in this matchup where you have to either go with Dodson or Dorian Williams. I'm scared not having Daquan Jones. We saw them abuse us in the trenches last year. I'm afraid that Mixon will have the possibility of having a strong game. I do think the Bills will be much better offensively than what we saw in the playoff game last year. I think the Cincinnati defense has holes that the Bills can exploit. But as I've told you in the past and people that are familiar, I am a person that very much I need to see the Bills execute against a team that they have struggled against before I believe that they will execute. I fully think they can, but I need to see it before I can believe it 100%.
Okay, there you have it. Let's see if Kevin is going to let Mike potentially take the lead or block him in the score predictions. Kevin, what do you got for us?
I'm taking the Bills here because, like I was saying earlier in this show, I think the Bills are going to have to start flipping some of these games where in the beginning of the year, you look and say, okay, maybe this could be a loss. And obviously you look at it now and it can still be a loss. But 5-3, one or two of those losses probably shouldn't have lost at least a Patriots game. I mean, that is definitely a game that you cannot drop. But regardless, the Bills have dropped one or two games that they shouldn't have. So that means that they're going to have to win one or two games now that maybe we thought they weren't going to. And now they're going to flip. And I think that the Bills' backs are, I don't want to say against the wall, but they know how big of a game this is. I'm trying to stay confident that Leonard Fournette and Rasul Douglas can maybe inject some confidence in this team. And again, I think this team found that fastball last week against Tampa Bay. They had the mini bye to continue to rest up. I'm going to take Buffalo in a close one here, 37-34.
Interesting, high scoring game. Kevin's pretty much hitting it all, and we'll see. I mean, he could take a big lead over Mike if the Bills do pull this one out.
He does. I hope he does.
Okay, so we got some hope by Mike. Just because of his prediction doesn't mean it's the end of the world. Mike hopes that Kevin takes a commanding score prediction lead as we go into the meat of the stretch of the schedule. It's going to be but we're going to have a lot more potential differences as the schedule goes on. Brings me to me, and there's a stat that sticks out to me and one that I released last year, 7-0 against teams that, coming off of a loss since the 2020 playoffs. Mike, 12-3 in your stat. Two of those being the COVID win. So take those away, looking at 12-1 in non-COVID related reschedulings. There's a lot of stats that show that Sean McDermott's team is very good coming off of the team losing to that team previously. So there's definitely some good numbers that come up from that. And I'm going to stick with it. I think that the Bills, between the emotional game that they had last year that was canceled, between the playoff game and the weather elements, I still think that game, they were a little bit undermanned. And since he was pretty full strength, but I still think that game goes a little bit differently if there is no elements last minute on the field. I don't believe that worked to their favor at all in that specific game. Dorsey needs to be better, but I do think it was a factor. I have the Bills in this game, and I think that there might be some defensive moments in this game, as we've seen throughout the last couple of weeks at times, at stretches. I think that new 11 personnel and the situation with Dalton Kincaid and with Khalil Shakir is going to get going. And I think the running game both ways is favor Bills defensively and offensively. So we're going to have to see how that all amounts in this specific game. So the Bills run game against the Cincy run defense, I think, is pro Bills in this matchup, especially with Josh Allen. And I think you see the best of Josh Allen. He's had a couple of extra days to rest that shoulder. So I have the Bills in this game, 27-20 in Cincinnati, to take care of business. And we'll see. Mike could take this game back and tie Kevin for the lead.
I don't want to, Kevin. I want to be wrong.
Or he could be in a commanding last play. So we'll see. There's a lot on the line for Mike specifically in this one. And maybe he's right. Or maybe he drops to the pits of despair in this game with the over-under at 48.5. And obviously, I'm right there in my prediction at 47, actually hitting the under. Kevin's hitting the over in this game. So final takeaways, Kevin. Why don't you bring us home with your final take on this spooky Halloween night on trade deadline day as we end the hour?
Well, when we were talking about Rasul Douglas, I was going to make this point and we never got around to it. So I'm going to circle back here. And I think that Rasul Douglas is going to be an immediate impact. I'm not going to say that he's going to start and he's going to shut down T. Higgins or Jamar Chase. But if you remember last year, the Bills acquired Nyheim Hines around the same time of the trade deadline. And then they talked about how they wanted to use him on offense and special teams. Well, do you know how many touches he had on offense? 11. He had 6 rushes and 5 receptions. Barely saw the field on offense. But I think this is a case, you don't have to learn the playbook as much on defense. I mean, this is a zone-heavy concept that Douglas was running in Green Bay, and I think that they can just quickly and easily insert him into the lineup. Again, maybe I shouldn't say Sunday night, but for this thicker part of the schedule, I think Rasul Douglas is going to make an immediate impact for this team. And going back to AJ's question from earlier, I think it did move the needle for me. Not a lot, but at least a little bit. And again, the confidence level is starting to rise.
There you have it. Please smash that like button. This show is brought to you by Sons of Erie, www.sonsoferie.com. Use promo code Going Deep for a nice deep discount on your goods. But from Kevin, will be back at you next week at the normal time, 7 o'clock, to break this game down and more as well as talk to you with a potential Broncos guest. Really some great people over there covering the Broncos. So I'm really looking forward to what they think from Sean Payton and their team next week as well. So tune in next week at 7. We'll be right back at you. But from the Going Deep podcast, we'll check you out soon, and happy Halloween to all of our listeners and all of our on-demand listeners. We'll see you guys soon.